Good evening, everyone. I have to start by saying hi. I am extremely surprised by how many of you are still here. You have powered through a very long day of conferences. I have to applaud your stamina. You are better people than I. I think I would have been gone, but thankfully I'm the one who has to give the presentation, so here I am. Oh, I get an applause on that. You're applauding yourselves because of your stayed. Okay, no, that's fine. I appreciate that. So why am I here? Why am I talking? Well, first of all, I've been in this industry for a while. So I'm going to talk about lean trailblazing. Lean trailblazing, why is that important today? And especially, how did I get to that conclusion with the history I have? So I've started out my career in the video game industry at Ubisoft Montreal. Did a couple of AAA games, the founders in my company, we were lead designers, producers, stuff like that. Afterwards, I was at Ludia in Montreal. So Ludia is known mostly for branded games. We've been lucky enough to be there for when the Wii took off, when the iPod took off, when free-to-play took off. So we saw a lot of transformations in the industry, and we were on the front line on experiencing that. Towards the end of Ludia, so Ludia got bought out, and we moved on to our next project, and we started looking at the industry to see, well, where are we now? What's important, what's next for us? And the best way I could explain how we analyze the industry, what we needed to do next, is an analogy with the same transformation, the same patterns we saw in Hollywood. So let me take you a little aside, tell you about how the Hollywood industry had transformed over the years. We had the golden age where basically movies existed, television was not yet existing, and you could not make a successful movie almost. If you would make a movie, you would put it out there, people would go buy a movie ticket and see it because there was more demand than there was supply. And that means that producing as many movies as possible regularly and supplying that demand was your main concern. So you would have these large studio lots where you would have the contracts to the cameraman, the writers, the actors, and you would just be churning movie after movie. And what happened eventually is there was something that disrupted this model. Television arrived. In your living room, you had quasi-unlimited content that was free, that didn't require the effort of going out. You could just enjoy there. And what that meant is all of a sudden there was a shift. The demand was not infinite, and the supply had just grown exponentially. What that did is people for a while were asking themselves the question, will television kill the movies? And we can look back today, there's enough distance to say, I think movies are still there, but they're not as easy and as free as they had been. So what happened with linear video content? Well, basically, we are now in a different system where there's not infinite demand. The supply has to find ways to stand out from each other. So we see a segmentation in the market. We're polarizing more and more. So this is just one way we could split the market in different axes, where we could have one which is what's the budget, and what's on the other axis, what's the level of commitment. So television versus cinema, where you have to go out, see something once, whereas television, it's from home whenever you're ready. Then you have the higher epic, where it's like, no, I want this big budget production, I want to be a top tier, versus something like a talk show, where literally all you need is faces on couches. Or the romantic comedy, which is the equivalent for movies, which all it needs is a bunch of faces you're willing to pay to watch them live emotions on film. So that's essentially how the industry evolves when the market is mature, is you're subdividing more and more to try and get that different audience. And your return on investment evolution is these two graphs where you're spending more and more per dollar to earn the same dollar as you're getting more and more precise in that mature market. Essentially, what we have is an industry then that had to evolve. A lot of studios dropped out. A lot of companies that were successful did not evolve for this because they were doing a strategy which was, let's stay how we were doing before. Let's make movies in the same way we were doing. It's kind of like loading up a wagon, sending through a labyrinth, and hoping it'll cross to the other side. That means it's much more expensive per try. Not every project's going to be viable, and it's more costly per try. But what happened is they started evolving the Hollywood model, where it's like, well, you know what? We need to know ahead if it's going to be a successful game. We need to research the market. We need to share the risk. We need to make products that will stand out more, create new segments in the market. So it became much more a skill set that went from production to market research, to understanding what's the reality of the market. So to use my company name, plug it in, it's about trailblazing, finding those new areas. And once that area has been found, someone has found that new niche, that new segment of the market, then you can load up the wagons, then you can cross on that found path and settle on the other side. So all this is about Hollywood. How does this concern us in the digital age? We're magical creatures. We don't have any of the realities of the physical world, right? We don't need to deal with that. But we have essentially the same pattern we've seen. We've had several golden ages because we managed to crash our first and restart in a new model. So those who know the history between Atari and Nintendo. But essentially, console as an era for retail was its golden age where there was demand for interactivity and we could basically make games. If you made a quality game, like a not wrong game, it would almost be harder to not make money. I remember how little we cared about being good project managers. You know, we had this whole culture of it doesn't matter that the first year is on the cutting room floor or that we're crunching to death or the next project we learned nothing. We're going to repeat the same mistakes because we're still successful. We didn't need to evolve. What happened is in the later ages is digital distribution and free-to-play. How does that compare in my cinema to television analogy is essentially how the barrier to entry got a lot lower. You don't have to spend as much to make a TV show, then you have to make a movie and distribute the movie. You don't have to be as big of a publisher with a whole retail network to reach players once things like Steam and the App Store were there. So the disruption was actually not so much that we weren't able to distribute digitally, but rather we had mass market digital distribution that was normalized through these platforms. So now we shifted our industry where, again, we see demand being smaller than the supply. Everybody is putting out there their game, and the problem is that means that to us, in terms of the cost of acquiring a user for the same dollar, so my same graph earlier of how much you're spending more and more, we have that in the digital age. We're getting way better at measuring it in all the different crazy ways, but essentially what it's telling us is for the same sale, for the same paying user, you're spending more and more in a mature market. I can go into the polarization of games that are made as a hobby versus games that are made as a premium product, games that are made for a high demand audience that want a full-fledged expectations versus games that are meant to fill those 30-second gaps when your burrito's in the microwave. We've segmented this market in every which way, format, audience, and whatnot, but there's still new ways to segment it. I'm just going to do a little side note because some of you are maybe in VR and AR and they're saying, oh, you know what, VR is the next disruption. Stop worrying. We're going to have a new disruption. It's going to be a new golden age with VR. My analysis is it's just another segmentation. It's not different enough because the expectations are too similar to what we had for the previous generation of products. It's the same kinds of skills and same kinds of people, and especially what's important is the people who have been successful in the previous generation will be able to be successful in the new generation. So yes, we have some new skills to learn, some new brands will emerge as the top players, but fundamentally it's not like the App Store or that's going to appear and change dramatically how business is made and have some new behemoths like a King or a Supercell that are now impossible to dislodge. So where are we as an industry? Going back to my analogy, is we're still mostly here. We're still mostly an industry that loads up completely the wagon, assuming we're going to found an entire city across the labyrinth, even though more than 75% of our wagons are going to die somewhere in the labyrinth or metaphorical desert. And it's really giving us a bad rep in terms of private investment looking at our industry saying, you know what, video games are bad. We shouldn't invest there. We can't invest in content because look at the return on investment, how much is spent versus how much is made. But us in the industry, we're just looking at the guy who got across and say, hey, we might be the next Flappy Bird. How can we be the next Flappy Bird, really? And that's the mobile equivalent. You can give yourself the equivalent retail or premium or whatever. The idea is we're losing a lot of wagons in the desert. So what can we do to get that equivalent of a lean scouting experiment? I'm sure most of you have heard of the concept of the lean startup. If not, I strongly recommend that as a read-up. There's a couple of great books on that we can talk about. But essentially, what is the lean startup is you have a hypothesis and you want to confirm it. And you line up all these questions in order of what is your biggest uncertainty, your biggest risk, and you move forward from there layer by layer by constantly talking to your end user client. So this can be, if I decide I am going to make aluminum siding as a company, you're going to be talking to who would buy aluminum siding before you sign the lease and you buy a lot of aluminum, right? It's not a passion industry. Of course you're going to do that. But video games, we're a passion industry. I really, really want to make this game. Hopefully, people really, really want to play it. That's not always the case. And I've even seen the case, no kidding, where someone really, really wanted to make the game. Themselves, they wouldn't play it. It's the making of the game that was fun. The playing of the game was no good. So what is the lean startup per project is essentially you take those practices of making all those assumptions that you need for your project to be successful, putting them into a scientific process of what is the hypothesis, what is the least expensive experiment I can make to try and reduce that uncertainty enough that I can build on that and go on to the next layer. Move away from the traditional gut-based industry where the highest paid person opinion, I don't know if you know that expression, the hippo. I love that expression. It's I am right in this meeting because I'm paid more than you. No actual data, no actual anything. It's I am the CEO, I am the creative director, I am the major shareholder. Because we don't know who's right, therefore, whoever's paid highest is right, right? So let's move that instead to, now we're in the digital age, we can measure everything. We can remove ego from the equation and start making data-driven experiments and decisions. So the first mind shift you need to do is, traditionally, we think of our industry as project-based, meaning products. One product, one project. When in reality, you need to shift that, knowing that we have a 75% failure rate. If you're a good company, by the way, you can have a 100% failure rate, of course. But a good company will have a 75% failure rate. So what you're actually doing as a project is finding the next viable product, and you're optimizing that project, not the product or one of the products that might be that project. So what that means is, for example, we're looking at an image here. This is one of Trailblazer's games that we did this process to, and it's a project that we use as our example to show this process, where the first version of the game is just a question. We see a lot of word games. None of them have stories. Do people who like words not like stories? I mean, I would have thought there's a correlation. So that's a hypothesis. Because there's nothing out there I can compare it to, I am either very wrong or potentially very right. I can pull my highest paid person opinion pin and say, well, we're doing this because I'm in charge, or we can make an experiment and try to find out. So the first step we would do is just test that promise, make ads for a game that don't exist yet. And literally, it looks like an ad that I could click through, and hopefully on the other side there's a game. There's no game. I lied to you, but I wanted to know if you would click. And I'm not going to spend the entire budget of making the entire game to find out would have you clicked on that game. I'm going to just make a game. And I'm going to flip through between these two slides, but essentially, I have all these assumptions. On the left of the screen, it's very much in free-to-play vocabulary, but trust me, on the right, you can see it comes down to the same thing, even if I was doing a premium game. But I'm testing one thing at a time, and I'm building a project that assumes I'm going to kill the project at each of these layers. And that's very important to communicate to the team. I have always worked with engineers who would love to over-engineer something, because if we do reach a live ops game that's going to be for 2 years running, it would be great if we had the best tool in the world for integrating new stories. But no, we're at the first step, which is just, will people who clicked on the ad install the game? Will people who install the game come back the next day, or will they just bounce right out? It's like, oh, when you said word game in the story, I had something in my mind, and you went somewhere else. You went somewhere crazy. That's not what I wanted at all. So when we go back to the art here, you see an evolution of the art of the game where we threw away so many versions of this game but we were learning something each time. So the character that's completely on the left took about 3 hours to make per character. We had a whole cast, a whole story in this art style, and it was good enough to see, would people who get inside the game stay in the game? That, we wanted the least costly product to just measure that. But once we move forward, and I want to measure, okay, I have people who are coming into the game and staying in the game, we are making the right game. Now I need a bigger sample because I'm measuring things that are finer, like the conversion to purchase or the long-term retention. In those cases, what becomes my bigger cost is my user acquisition, the advertising spend I'm doing. So then I can go back and I can say, I'm going to triple the budget of art because it's going to have a huge impact in reducing my user acquisition. I threw out all my old art. If I'm doing that, I can even revisit assumptions like, you know what? Should I go towards a more serious or a more cartoony angle? I'm starting to know my users more and more. I can start doing experiments like that. So we tested out. The two are interesting, viable audiences, but in the end, the wider audience we opted for was this cartoony style on the right. So we rewrote the story. It doesn't matter. The cost of doing a new iteration on something right is completely reasonable if you're working towards the right game, that you have the data that tells you, oh, we're working on something right. And what's brilliant about this is you have a team that now knows more and more their real audience, that it's within the team itself. They're aligning better. They're working more efficiently because they understand better and better that persona they're working for. Once you've found your success, that's where you've crossed the desert. Now you've found your city. Now you exploit. You have a new segment. You've found a new gaming audience, demographic, or whatever. So this is where you start saying, well, the big risk, the big investment of inventing this word game plus story hybrid, it's like, okay, well, the first skin that we did was a 1950s reporter. Is that the only skin that's viable? Is it addressing 100% of the word game plus story audience? No. I can, of course, by then see, well, would a near future hacker sci-fi story work? Oh, well, it's actually complementary. It's working out. It's getting those male users I was not getting as much with the other story. Should I go get the brand of Murder, She Wrote and get another audience and especially start making defensive maneuvers? Because if I'm not going to do it, another company's going to be my evil clone and take my hard work. So that's also why I want to see the concept of a project, to think of it as multi-product, is because if you're taking the risk to explore and find new segments, you also should be considering how you're going to be able to leverage your discovery. One of the saddest things that we can have right now in the industry is we let all the indies take risks, do that exploration, die in the desert by troves, and then the one that survives at the other end doesn't have the means, doesn't have the plan, and then you just have all the clone companies come in and reap his benefit. So that's why you have to think also in terms of, if my job as a company is to innovate, is to create new segments, part of how you're going to maximize that is to have the plan how you're going to really mine that gold that you prospected. I want to address a couple of also other assumptions. I'm talking about lean in terms of project, in terms of iterating and killing along the way if you're going somewhere that's not viable. But I also want to talk about lean teams in particular. One of the assumptions that we keep seeing in our industry is going back to our big studio model, Warner Brothers lot, where I have all the contract of the actors, the writers, and whatnot, where it's the most cost-effective way to churn out movies in a row. And we still have large studios that are descendant from that logic, where we were making these console games one in a row, but as you'll have noticed, there's less and less of them. The few ones that are left have to revise how they're doing it. There's still a segment for that, where, oh, I found a new franchise, I'm going to milk it over a year, sell a new Assassin's Creed every year until that dies and whatnot. And sorry, this is not bashing of that model. This is a segment that needs to be occupied. People want to buy that type of game. But if you, as an independent or a startup or as a smaller, you don't have 5 projects wide and you can't shift resources from one to the other, but you're still building a whole team, assuming that you're creating a game that's going to be successful, that's going to be a franchise that you're going to keep doing year after year, most of the time that means you're going to die under the weight of your own team. The costs of your salaries of your employees are going to be your main source of concern. And what happens then is it changes your priorities. It becomes, I need to occupy this person that I'm paying. I don't necessarily need more work from him, but you start doing that because you can't imagine paying someone to do nothing. Or you start selecting your projects not based on an opportunity in the market. It's like, oh, I have a hypothesis of something that could be a new segment to explore. You start choosing projects based on who you have. Well, I have this team that's excellent at shooting people in the head in video games. We should make that as well. Well, there's a lot in that segment of shoot people in the face already. Even if your team's really good at making shoot people in the face games, is it a competitive advantage truly or not? You get biased if you have an internal team. So one of the things I've been pitching a lot to studios lately is the idea of working in that Hollywood model, which is you put together a core team for the exploration phase. You know, who's the best director, who's the best writer, who's the best lighting director, whatever. But you're putting together a project, you're exploring, you're focus group testing, or you're doing those lean experiments. But as the volume increases, where, for example, Wars of Power, I need 30 characters for the full launch. If I hire up a team of artists, assuming that I'm successful, I also have to either fire a bunch of people or die under my weight, because on a portfolio, on an average, only 1 out of 4 projects, if I'm good, is actually going to reach that live ops stage. So this is where having a healthy network of contractors, freelancers, service companies is really a positive aspect of where our industry is evolving, because this is the best way we can remain lean, make those experiments, but we can still have external people that are going to be very specialized, they're going to be the best at what they do. So a couple of misconceptions I want to address when you're thinking about that model. First one is, well, it's just not cost efficient to hire someone externally because they have higher rates. Well, there's a couple of different ways that can be wrong. The first one being that you can just recoup often by productivity. I don't know if it's a secret for most of you, but when you get your salary increase of 3, 4, 5%, your productivity probably went up more than that. You're kind of splitting the benefit of you becoming better and better between the employer and yourself. It's kind of a rev share deal. The external people, in theory, you're hiring the best person and not just the least worst person that would accept to work for your company. And that's especially a meaningful message for a startup. It's like, hey, I don't know if I'm going to be alive in a year. You have an amazing history career at this company. Quit and take a risk with me. Some will, some won't. But the idea is, if someone is able to live as a freelancer with an expert skill, they're choosing that lifestyle, that also means that they were good enough at the lifestyle to live off of it. So the high-cost freelancers, in my experience, make up for their cost by their productivity, especially if I consider how much of my time I need to spend with them. My favorite service companies and freelancers are the ones that require the least supervision from myself, because I count my costs, like the cost per character. If I don't have an artist who's able to themselves review themselves and make a higher standard than what I have, well, I have to add my time per character as well. I'm not doing something else. And even if you don't pay yourself all your hours, you're working 90 hours a week, which is its own subject. I can go into why that's not brilliant. You should still put that as part of your calculation. And also, when thinking of people's rates, don't forget that if you had an internal employee, consider their rate, that they would generate vacations, you would need equipment, they would need software. Make it a fair comparison. Don't just look at the hourly rate plus the hourly salary rate. The other important point as why externals are preferable to internals during this exploration phase is you're only paying them for when you need them. So we've done a lot of consulting work as well as the internal projects we do, and it's easily demonstratable when someone not only took more time to do the same task than an external expert could have done, but there are periods where you don't need that UI artist. You need a UI artist during the project, but not necessarily true from the first day to the last day of the project, especially when you're towards the end where you're still not ready to fully launch, you're in live ops and you're just trying to tweak the balancing of the game. Then you just have a part of your attention that's giving busy work to a UI artist or extending the content for a game that might get killed. So essentially you're spending somewhere where you would not be choosing and you're not keeping your focus on answering those questions. So this is just another example here where I'm trying to illustrate in a simple graph. The graphs are simplified, but I can give you these real cases over and over again where it would have been preferable. And this does include things like tax credits. You can say, oh, well, if it's an internal employee, for example, in Quebec, it's 37.5% of the salary if he's internal, and it's half that if it's external. Even with that difference, all those calculations still worked out in all these projects I'm mentioning where you're exploring, is this a project worth bringing or not? But that being said, once you do get a successful product, like your premium game is launched and it's selling well and you want to make the sequel, you want to make DLC, you want to maintain it because maintaining it is now almost obligatory even if it isn't a free-to-play game, or you do have a free-to-play game that's going to successfully live over 2 years, you're going to milk that gold mine you found. I'm crossing analogies and hopefully you'll forgive me. So then, by all means, now's the time to build a factory because you've found that gold mine. Now you're building an optimized process, an optimized team. You're getting the best team possible. You're bringing as much of it internally to shave off costs. Now you're optimizing a success. That's where we can go back towards the more traditional team format. So that brings me to the end of my presentation with just enough time for some questions. So broad line recap. Lean startup applied to every project. A project is the exploration of which product will become successful and will go into ongoing operations. It is not a single product per project. Thank you very much. Anybody have a question? Was I that clear? No? Okay. Yes, please.
Just to get back to the whole kind of like testing and marketing, right? In terms of branding, how do you go about testing the market? In terms of like, do you put Trailblazer out there, like we're launching these new product, and then you kind of just go to a dumb link, or do you go under shell companies or things like that?
So his question was about how do we do those ad tests before there's an actual product? Do we do it as Trailblazer? Do we do it as a dumb company? And do we, where does the link go? And it's an extremely valid question because that's something that's evolved over the last 2 years when we've been doing this process. So we've been doing some versions of it where it goes to a fan page, sometimes it goes to a web page. Right now, the best version of it is there's services where you can get a fake store. So you can even know the cost of install, not just the cost of a click-through rates, because you haven't faked all the end. And even if it ends up nowhere, I mean, we're not looking for signups for a future game that may only come out in 2 years. Yes, we're wasting these potential players in that potential test market. In the past, we have used a non-branded company to test, but we're testing the real brands of the game. So the first version of Words Are Power had this other brand that was not Trailblazer and this other territory, and it still garnered more press than I had expected. So it's kind of a weird thing. We're still deciding how to react with a community that's appearing way before we're ready for the game. I mean, we don't have even a Brazilian version of the game. Brazil is where we have the most fans for this game as we speak. I don't know how that happened. It's kind of one of those symptoms that I guess shows the promise of the project's potential. Does that answer your question well? Anybody else?
Actually, I have a follow-up question. In terms of budgeting, what kind of budget do you go for detail?
So his question is the budgeting for the test. I'm going to switch back to the slide with the layers. So roughly speaking, you want each layer to cost as little as possible, but that depends on the project. For example, we had a 3D real-time lighting strategy game that was one of the things we wanted to experiment. That one was literally 10 times the price when we're going through the iterations below. But the first step is, honestly, it's super lean. Because when you think about it, for things like click-through rate and for the cost of an install, which is somewhere between $1, $10, what's the population size? What's the right sample you need to know that's within the margin of error that you find acceptable to answer your question? So for less than $5,000, you probably have the entire iteration of the art direction, the promise, and all that for one product. And the way we look at it is you want to not just refine one thing by A/B testing, but you're putting it in competition with other things. So we have usually 3 projects wide. They're not necessarily all at the same step in this onion layer process, but they're in competition with each other because we ask ourselves, not just, is this good enough to continue, is amongst all the options we have, where is the next best place to put our money? You don't look at what you've already spent. That's another rule of management that people don't necessarily inhabit well. You have to detach yourself from the past and say, not because I've spent already $500,000 on this that it's the right thing to spend my next $100,000. It may be better to start at something new. It may be better to, and a lot of our industry is not geared towards that. If you think of programs like the CMF, I'm highly critical of some certain things about the government programs and all that. It's part of my job to lobby with these things to help them evolve towards something more healthy. But one of the things that's problematic is because they're product-based, not project-based, they kind of force you to finish a game that's not going to, you can learn along the way that's not the right game. They are human beings that are understanding, and you can talk with them and help. They will pivot with you, but the fundamental language, the fundamental structure kind of is like bring it to term even though it's not viable, and that kind of reinforces the statistic that in Canada in particular, we're spending a lot for little return. We're scaring away private investment because a lot of things are structured that way that say, keep on spending despite you knowing you shouldn't, because if you don't deliver a finished product, that means that you're not going to get the next program, the next project. So it's a self-harming program in reality versus the reality of the majority of projects are supposed to fail and we should be optimizing failure. Question at the back.
How this has been working for you? Like how many projects typically do you run down and kill versus survive to the second and third level and then kill versus the one that goes down and is successful?
So his question was trying to give more of a numbers on terms of how many projects are getting killed, how many are going on. So we're ourselves a lean startup, so I'm going to combine statistics from the outside as well as inside. So we have internally 3 projects that one has been fully killed, the other one has been frozen because the other one is showing so much opportunity. So Words of Power is the one going forward. So for internal capacity, and also because we always want to have at least one project demonstrating a process, that's our own statistic right now. But we spend a lot of time on consulting work as well and partnership work, so with a dozen different partners. And the statistic there is a lot more scary because people who invite us to consult typically are already failing and they want a confirmation. So they're looking for someone to give the numbers to it. So very much our message to the industry in general who want to work with us and learn about this process is the earlier the better to have this conversation, because very often the initial assumption of just how you're modeling what the project's return on investment versus the risk is, we can demonstrate at the beginning that it's not a risk worth taking, but they still went ahead and made an entire game, and they're asking us at the end, it's like, oh, we're not getting positive key performance indicators. Can you doctor it up and all that? And the analysis is not, we can nudge a bit and we're going always back to the root and we figure out what's the population this is targeting at which level of success. And if everything was perfect, what would be the results and can we bring there? And from there, yeah, more often than not, our honest answer is you should kill because I mean, if you went that far into the project without having asked those fundamental questions of, is there an audience? Is there a level of competition that I'm able to compete at? Do I have an advantage over the competition? Really, all those questions a lean startup should be asking. So what we're doing right now is by doing these conferences and all that, we're hoping to bring that message to as many people as possible so the questions are asked a lot earlier. But Canada in general is a bit behind in those aspects, which is why the consulting percentage right now is 100%. Please kill as quickly as possible with fire.
Someone wants to see that movie. Don't make the game until you are sure someone wants to play that game.
And even so, yeah, that's exactly true. Don't make something unless you know someone wants it, and even more wants it more than what's already there. So that's another aspect you can do if you're aiming for a competitive space. Literally, buy ads for your opponent in parallel to yours. You're in competition. Can you outperform them? If you can't, at low volume, generate better results than your competition, then don't even go in there. Don't even try. They're already there. They're ahead of you. They already have an audience. They have the tools. They have the possibility to potentially reskin the game. If you really did find a new niche fantasy, it's like, oh, it turns out they want elves in space. We can do that. We can do it too. So that's why one of the most fundamental things, often people think they're innovating. It's like, oh, no, my game is completely different. I have this completely new way to shoot someone in the face. And I listen to them, I understand, and I say, well, tell you what, I'm not going to just pull my weight and say I'm the expert and you know nothing. Let's measure. Can people outside the game understand just, it has to be a one sentence, one image concept of why shooting people in the face in your game is different than the others. And sometimes it's true, like the horror game in space, Dead Space. Yeah, they were able to say, well, it's dismemberment, but don't get me off topic. It's still about shooting people. But it was a very different fantasy and a very different core mechanic, and it was something that they were able to stand out within that very heavily competitive space. So buy ads in parallel to the game you're making that hasn't existed yet. Buy ads for competitors so you know what you're benchmarking yourself against. Did I go way off your question, or is that? Because I do like the sound of my own voice. I'll just keep talking.
Sorry, that's like all the time we have.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And if there was a follow-up question, I'll hang out just a teeny bit more. Thanks.